Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into some really fascinating sources about the Quran, its history, how it was preserved, that kind of thing. We're basically trying to get clarity on a few core questions that often come up. How stable is the text, really? Were there lots of different versions floating around before, say, the 1920s? And then what about the physical evidence? How far back does the written record actually go? Plus the big one. Why does the Quran share so many stories with the Bible and the Torah? Lots to unpack.
Absolutely. It's a topic that sits right at the crossroads of, well, history, theology, and some pretty detailed textual analysis. The key, I think, is to be systematic, look at the evidence we have for the text itself, the ways it was recited, and how it all fits together historically. We're aiming for an unbiased understanding based on the sources.
Okay, let's jump into that first point then, textual stability. There's this specific date, 1924, the Cairo edition, that often gets mentioned. Sometimes people hear that and think, so before 1924, it was all over the place, different books entirely.
Yeah, that's a common misconception. The 1924 Cairo edition was definitely a landmark, no doubt, but it was a landmark of standardization, specifically for modern printing. It wasn't about creating the text or forcing some kind of unity that didn't exist. The unity at the core level was much, much older.
Right. So to understand that, we need to get into these two concepts you mentioned earlier, the Razm and the Qur'an.
Exactly. These are crucial. They sound technical, but the idea is pretty straightforward once you break it down. Think of the Razm first. That's the core consonantal text, just the letters, the basic skeleton of the words, without the short vowels or dots that tell you exactly how to pronounce each consonant, at least not initially.
Like the bare bones of the words.
Precisely. The architectural blueprint, maybe? And this Razm, this consonantal skeleton, was established and considered stable very, very early on.
Okay, so that's the stable foundation. What about the Qur'an then? What role do they play?
So, if the Razm is the blueprint, or the sheet music, the Qur'an are the established, approved ways of, bringing that blueprint to life. The different ways of reciting it, they add the vocalization, the specific pronunciation nuances, maybe slight variations reflecting different teaching traditions or regional accents. But crucially, they all map back to that same stable Razm.
So it's not different meanings, but different ways of voicing the same core text.
Exactly. It allows for a kind of controlled diversity within a unified framework. You maintain the core message while accommodating how different communities actually spoke and learned the text.
That makes sense. And this idea of a stable core text, the Razm, goes way back, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To the time of the third caliph, Uthman.
Yes, right back to the mid-7th century, roughly 650 to 676 CE. The traditional accounts tell us Uthman became concerned. He was hearing reports that Muslims in different parts of the expanding caliphate were reciting verses differently, sometimes leading to disputes. This was based on the personal copies or notes people had, perhaps influenced by different companions they learned from.
A potential source of serious division, I meant.
A huge source. So Uthman commissioned a committee. Their job was to compile a single standard master copy, the Musaf, based on the best available written materials, and very importantly, checking it against the memory of those companions, the Hufaz, who had memorized the entire Qur'an directly.
Okay, that sounds like a move towards unity, but then there's the controversial part, isn't there? The sources say he ordered other existing copies, personal ones compiled by respective figures like Ibn Masud or Ubay ibn Ka'b, to be destroyed. Doesn't that seem counterproductive if the goal is preservation? Doesn't it risk looking like suppression of alternatives?
It's definitely a point scholars debate, and you have to see it in the context of that specific moment. The priority was preventing fragmentation of the community, Ummah. From the traditional Islamic perspective, Uthman wasn't destroying core revelation. He was eliminating minor variations in wording or dialect found in those personal copies that hadn't gone through this rigorous central verification process. By establishing one standard Razm based on the consensus of the main companions and removing the non-standardized personal copies, he aimed to ensure everyone was literally on the same page, preventing future disputes based on textual discrepancies. It was a consolidation effort.
So the argument is that he cemented the Razm, the skeleton, but the ways of reading still allowed for some variation.
Yes, the system of approved Qur'an developed to handle the acceptable variations in pronunciation and vocalization based on that Uthmanic Razm.
And just to be clear for listeners, what kind of variations are we actually talking about in these Qur'an? Are they changing the stories or the laws?
Oh, absolutely not. We're talking about very subtle differences. things like whether a particular word is pronounced with a slightly different vowel sound, or maybe a tiny dot changes one consonant to a closely related one, like a T sound versus the sound in certain contexts. Sometimes a minor grammatical marker might differ, but these don't alter the fundamental meaning or doctrine. It's more akin to, say, the difference between saying tomato and tomato. The vegetable is the same.
Got it. So the core meaning is preserved across these accepted readings.
Correct. And that brings us back to 1924. With the rise of mass printing, there was a need for a single, fully vocalized text that could be typeset easily. The committee in Cairo chose one of the most widely used and respected Qiyat, the Hafs and Asim reading, and meticulously marked up the Uthmanic rasm according to that specific recitation system.
So they picked one established performance of the sheet music, basically, and wrote down all the details for the printer.
That's a good analogy. It provided a standard text for global distribution via the printing press. But it's crucial to remember this didn't invalidate the other canonical Qur'an. Readings like the Warsh recitation, for example, are still widely used, studied, and recited today, especially in parts of North and West Africa. The 1924 edition's dominance is largely due to the reach of printed media.
Okay, that really clarifies the 1924 situation's standardization for print, based on a long tradition of a stable core, rasm, and accepted variations in recitation, Qur'an. Now, this talk about the written core, the rasm, leads perfectly into our next big question, the physical evidence. What's the oldest piece of the Qur'an we actually have? Let's talk about that Birmingham manuscript.
Yes, the Birmingham Folios, part of the Mingana collection at the University of Birmingham. This was and is a huge discovery in Quranic studies. What makes it so significant is the radiocarbon dating performed on the parchment itself, the animal skin the text is written on.
And the results were pretty startling, right?
Absolutely. The test dated the parchment with a 95.4% probability to the period between 568 and 645 CE.
Okay, let's pause on those days. 568 to 645 CE. The Prophet Muhammad lived from roughly 570 to 632 CE.
Exactly. This means the parchment itself was prepared either during the Prophet's lifetime or at the very latest within about 13 years of his death. It's incredibly early.
Wow. So what does that tell us? What's the implication of having parchment that old with Quranic text on it?
It's profound. Firstly, it pushes back against older theories that suggested the Qur'an might have existed purely or mostly as an oral tradition for a long time, maybe decades or even centuries, before being reliably written down. This manuscript shows that no, verses were being written down on parchment, which was an expensive material using a recognized script, the Hijazi script, extremely early on. It confirms a very early written tradition alongside the oral one.
So writing was part of the preservation from the get-go, essentially.
It seems very likely, yes, but the age is only part one. Part two is what's on the parchment, the text itself.
Right. The manuscript contains parts of surahs 18, 19, and 20. How does that text compare to, say, a standard Qur'an you'd find today?
This is the really crucial finding for textual stability. When scholars compared the rasm, that consonantal skeleton we talked about on these ancient Birmingham folios,
Yes.
it was essentially identical to the rasm found in modern Qur'ans printed today, like the 1924 Cairo edition text. Allowing for the development of script styles over time, the core text, the sequence of consonants is the same.
Identical. So
Yeah.
a manuscript potentially from the time of the Prophet or just after shows the same fundamental text we have now.
That's what the evidence strongly suggests. It's powerful physical proof supporting the traditional Muslim claim about the meticulous preservation and stability of the Quranic text from the very beginning. It directly challenges views that the text underwent significant changes or only finalized much later. This provides a physical anchor right back to the earliest period.
That's incredibly significant evidence. Okay, so we've tackled stability and early physical proof. Let's shift gears to the content itself for our final section. This is about the overlap. Anyone who reads the Qur'an alongside the Bible or Torah immediately notices, well, a lot of familiar names and stories. Why is that?
Yes, the shared narrative landscape is vast. It's undeniable and fundamental to understanding the Qur'an's relationship with the earlier Abrahamic faiths. You find accounts of creation, Adam and Eve, Noah or Nu, and the flood, Abraham, Ibrahim, Moses, Musa leading the Exodus, figures like Lot, Joseph, Solomon, David, the list goes on. And of course, significant figures from the New Testament tradition like Jesus, his virgin birth, miracles, and his mother Mary, Maryam, who even has a whole surah named after her.
So it's drawing from the same well of prophetic history. But the accounts aren't always identical, are they? There are often differences in details, sometimes quite significant ones.
Correct. And those differences are often where the theological and historical discussions really focus. A classic example you often hear cited is the story of Abraham's near sacrifice of his son.
Right. In the Bible, Genesis clearly names the son as Isaac.
Whereas the Quran, while not explicitly naming the son in the main passage, is traditionally understood by Muslims, based on other references and interpretations, to be referring to Ishmael. That difference is very telling about the different perspectives.
Okay, so let's look at those perspectives. How does Islamic theology explain this overlap and these differences? Is it seen as borrowing?
Emphatically, no, not borrowing. From the Islamic theological standpoint, the overlap exists because the source is the same. The one God, Allah. The Quran is understood as the final, complete, and perfectly preserved revelation in a long chain of messages delivered by prophets recognized in Judaism and Christianity. So, Tawhid, the oneness of God, also implies a unity of the core divine message.
So the Quran is seen as confirming the essential truths that were in the earlier scriptures.
Exactly. It's confirming the core message of monotheism and righteous conduct, but it's also seen as correcting errors or distortions that, according to Islamic belief, crept into the previous scriptures over time through human interference or misinterpretation. This concept is called ta'rif.
So the differences, like Ishmael instead of Isaac, aren't mistakes. They're seen as divine corrections of the record.
Precisely. They are viewed as restoring the original intended narrative and clarifying points where the previous messages were allegedly altered or misunderstood. The Quran presents itself as the ultimate criterion, confirming what is true in the earlier books and correcting what is not.
Okay, that's the faith-based perspective, divine continuity and correction. How does the academic, historical, critical perspective approach this same data, the overlaps and differences?
Well, the historical critical method generally approaches it from a secular, non-theological standpoint. Scholars using this method look at the historical context of 7th century Arabia. They see a region that wasn't isolated. Mecca was a trade hub, and there were established and diverse Jewish and Christian communities throughout the Arabian Peninsula and surrounding areas, Syria, Yemen, Ethiopia. Think various strands of Eastern Christianity, Rabbinic Judaism.
So a religiously pluralistic environment.
Very much so. From this perspective, the most straightforward explanation for the shared stories is cultural and literary interaction. The Prophet Muhammad, living in this milieu, would likely have encountered these biblical and extra-biblical narratives through oral traditions, trade contacts, and community interactions.
And the differences in the stories, how are they viewed?
They are often analyzed as adaptations or reinterpretations of those existing traditions, perhaps reflecting specific versions circulating orally, or deliberate reshaping to fit the Qur'an's specific theological message, or maybe even misunderstandings of the source narratives as they were encountered. So, where the theological view sees divine correction, the historical critical view tends to see a process more akin to literary adaptation or borrowing within a shared cultural environment. The term errors might sometimes be used when comparing Quranic details strictly against the biblical original, though that implies a judgment the historical method tries to avoid.
Two very different ways of interpreting the same phenomenon, the shared stories. One sees divine lineage, the other sees cultural transmission.
Exactly. And it highlights how our starting assumptions, faith-based or historical critical, shape how we make sense of the evidence. Both perspectives acknowledge the Qur'an's deep engagement with the Abrahamic past, but they explain the reason for that engagement very differently.
It really underscores that the Qur'an isn't positioning itself in isolation. It's actively engaging with, responding to, and from its perspective, completing the traditions that came before it.
Without a doubt, that relationship is woven into its very fabric.
So, bringing everything together,
Yeah.
we've seen this sophisticated system for preserving the text, the stable rasm combined with the living tradition of Qur'an. And then, remarkably, we have physical evidence like the Birmingham manuscript, basically conferring that textual core goes right back to the very beginning.
Yes, the convergence of the manuscript evidence and the textual tradition provides a strong case for remarkable preservation. It shows a text transmitted with extraordinary care over centuries, and this carefully preserved text, as we just discussed, then consciously situates itself within that broader Abrahamic narrative, claiming both continuity and ultimate authority.
It's a text deeply aware of its historical context and its theological claims.
Indeed.
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a fascinating final thought to consider. We have this text, its stability powerfully supported by early physical evidence like the Birmingham folios. We also see its deep, undeniable connection to the stories foundational to Judaism and Christianity. So the question becomes, how do you ultimately interpret that connection? Do those shared narratives primarily point to a common human and religious heritage evolving through cultural contact? Or do they signify a deliberate act of divine confirmation and correction, as the text itself claims? The evidence supports the stability. The interpretation of the content rests on the framework you employ.